Steve Harvey gets mocked in court, then stuns the judge with his genius legal skills. Picture this. The courtroom reeked of manufactured drama, a far cry from the buoyant spectacle of acrobats and grease paint. Here, the atmosphere felt predatory, akin to a menagerie where creatures were prodded and provoked. A bank of television cameras, their crimson recording lights burning like accusing eyes, amplified Steve Harvey's discomfort. Trapped in a rented suit that clung to him with unforgiving tightness, he felt like precisely that kind of animal. Across the aisle, Chad Sterling, a man carved from granite and radiating self-importance, adjusted his bespoke jacket. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice a burnished baritone. "We convened today because Mr. Stephen Harvey presumed he could simply flout a legally binding agreement. A contract, I remind you, conceived by some of this state's most astute legal minds, intellects that, I assure you, far surpass Mr. Harvey's, shall we say, insights." A wave of stifled chuckles rippled through the gallery, each one a tiny barb. Steve's jaw hardened. The palpable disdain radiating from Sterling felt like a physical shove. Mr. Harvey, a media personality, a so-called relationship guru, and dare I suggest. Chad paused, a smirk dancing on his lips. A comedian, evidently believed himself wiser than seasoned attorneys, shrewder than established businessmen, smarter than, well, everyone involved. He dismissed Steve with a wave of his hand. He operates under the delusion that he can disregard commitments he willingly entered, stipulations designed to safeguard the interests of my client, Mr. Reginald Thornton. The camera lens swung, revealing Reginald Thornton in the front row, a portrait of affluence and authority. Silver strands, sculpted into place, caught the light like frozen fire. His gaze, glacial and detached, swept over Steve as if he were nothing more than a troublesome fly. Clad in a suit that likely surpassed the value of Steve's vehicle, a subtle smile played on his lips, the smug anticipation of a predator tasting impending victory. Steve had seen that smile before, etched on the faces of studio moguls in his early career, a condescending assumption from those who believed they held the key to his essence. "Mr. Thornton," Chad resumed, his voice regaining its velvet smoothness, "is a beacon in this community. A patron of the arts, an innovator, a man dedicated to the upliftment of others. And how is he repaid? With litigation. He is dragged into this hall by a man who believes himself exempt from accountability." Chad paced before the jury, each movement deliberate, precise. "We will establish, beyond all reasonable doubt, that Mr. Harvey knowingly and deliberately violated his agreement with Mr. Thornton. The evidence will speak for itself. We will lay bare the facts. And we will demonstrate that Mr. Harvey's actions were not merely unlawful, but also unscrupulous." Steve watched, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The narrative was stacked against him. A self-made man facing off against a titan of inherited wealth. He was David without the sling, clad in discount attire. He risked a glance at his lawyer, Sarah Chin, seated beside him, her expression a carefully constructed mask of composure. The almost imperceptible tremor in her fingers as she scribbled notes betrayed her inner tension. He trusted Sarah's abilities, but even her formidable intellect seemed overshadowed by Sterling's imposing presence, by Thornton's unwavering, icy stare. Chad concluded his opening statement with a theatrical flourish. "We are confident that, after careful deliberation, you will rule in favor of Mr. Thornton, and that Mr. Harvey will be held responsible for his choices." He turned towards Steve, his eyes gleaming with thinly veiled contempt. "We trust that justice will prevail." The cameras zeroed in on Steve's face. He forced himself to meet their lenses, to tune out the murmurs from the gallery, to resist the suffocating pressure weighing him down. He knew he was the underdog, the clear disadvantage. But he also possessed the crucial advantage that Sterling and Thornton overlooked: resilience. He had a narrative to disseminate, and he would do so, even if it meant challenging the entire establishment. This circus, he mused, was about to take an unforeseen turn. He murmured to Sarah, his voice barely audible, "All right, let's get to work." From coalfields to comedy stages. The air hung thick with coal dust and the scent of damp earth, a perfume Steve knew better than Chanel. Summers in Welch, West Virginia, were a symphony of cicadas and the rhythmic clang of the minecarts, a lullaby that rocked him to sleep. His daddy, a bear of a man with hands like shovels, emerged each evening coated in black, his eyes the only white visible. Steve, barely tall enough to reach the porch swing, would wait with a glass of sweet tea, the sugar barely masking the grit in the air. Life was a hustle from the get-go. It wasn't about getting ahead, it was about getting by. Steve learned early that a silver tongue could buy you more than a silver dollar. He charmed Mrs. Henderson out of extra cookies, trade marbles with the older boys, always coming out on top. It wasn't about cheating, it was about negotiation, understanding what people wanted, what they'd trade for it. One sweltering summer, he and his cousin, Mikey, started a lemonade emporium, as Steve grandly called it. Mikey made the lemonade, watery, tart, and mostly ice, while Steve handled the sales. He'd stand by the dusty road, flagging down cars heading to the lake, spinning yarns about the secret family recipe and the pure mountain spring water used in its creation. People bought it, not because it was good, but because Steve made them smile. He had a way of connecting, of making them feel like they were in on a joke, even if they didn't know what the punchline was. His intuition was uncanny. He could size a person up in seconds, their anxieties, their desires, their weaknesses. He knew when to push and when to back off. He once talked a traveling salesman out of his entire inventory of encyclopedias, convincing him that the families in Welch were desperate for knowledge, even though half the town couldn't read. He then sold the encyclopedias door to door for a fraction of the price, making a killing and leaving the salesman scratching his head. School was a different story. Steve was bright but restless. He couldn't stand the rote memorization, the rigid rules. He was a performer, not a student. He needed an audience, a stage. Detention was his regular gig. One afternoon, cleaning the chalkboard for what felt like the 100th time, he noticed Mrs. Crabtree, the principal, looked particularly glum. He'd seen that look before, the weight of the world settling on someone's shoulders. He stopped wiping and, on a whim, told her a joke he'd overheard his daddy telling his buddies down at the mine. It was a bit risque, but Mrs. Crabtree, after a moment of stunned silence, burst out laughing. A genuine, hearty laugh that shook her jowls. From that day on, detention became a little less detention. Why? Steve would tell her jokes, stories, anything to lift her spirits. He learned that even the toughest people had a soft spot, a vulnerability that could be reached with the right words. Leaving Welch wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. He needed a bigger stage, a brighter spotlight. The coalfields were a dead end, a slow suffocation. He packed a suitcase, a handful of dollars, and a head full of dreams. He knew he had something special, a gift, a way of making people laugh, of making them listen. He just needed to find the right place to use it. He didn't know it then, but that place would be a courtroom. The audience would be a judge, a jury, and a lawyer with a vendetta. And the stakes? Higher than he could ever imagine. Evidence and insults. The air in the courtroom thickened, the scent of old wood and barely contained animosity clinging to the velvet curtains. Chad, Thornton's impeccably tailored lawyer, adjusted his spectacles, a glint of predatory satisfaction in his eyes. He held up a thick sheaf of papers. "Your Honor," he began, his voice resonating with practiced authority. "We now present definitive proof of the defendant's, shall we say, creative interpretation of contractual obligations." He laid out the evidence, a series of emails, printed with laser precision, detailing Steve's increasingly outlandish promises to Thornton, a guaranteed 300% return on investment in 6 months, assurances of celebrity endorsements from individuals who had, in reality, never heard of Thornton's revolutionary self-stirring teacup. There was also a contract, initialed by Steve, which appeared to grant Thornton exclusive rights to market the teacup across the entire solar system. Thornton himself sat at the plaintiff's table, radiating an almost palpable smugness. He subtly adjusted his silk tie, a barely perceptible smirk playing on his lips. He was a man accustomed to getting his way, and the carefully orchestrated display of evidence seemed to guarantee his victory. Judge Thompson, initially amused by the sheer audacity of Steve's earlier performance, was now tapping a pen against his desk, a frown etching itself onto his usually jovial face. He peered over his spectacles at Steve, who was currently attempting to untangle a particularly stubborn knot in his shoelace. The contrast between Chad's meticulous presentation and Steve's disheveled appearance was stark, almost comical. "Mr. Harvey," the judge said, his voice tinged with a note of rising impatience. "Do you have any counter-evidence to present? Perhaps an explanation for these exuberant claims?" Steve finally wrestled free of the shoelace, oblivious to the growing tension in the room. He looked up, his expression genuinely bewildered. "Exuberant? I thought they were quite reasonable, given the cosmic potential of the self-stirring teacup." Chad snorted, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Cosmic potential? The only thing cosmic about this is the size of Mr. Harvey's ego." He turned back to the judge. "As you can see, Your Honor, the defendant preyed upon Mr. Thornton's good faith with promises that were patently absurd. He took advantage of a successful businessman's innovative spirit to line his own pockets." Steve, finally seeming to grasp the severity of the situation, ran a hand through his already chaotic hair. He glanced at the documents Chad had presented, his eyes widening slightly. He muttered something under his breath about needing his interdimensional decoder ring to understand the fine print. Thornton leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "Perhaps you should have thought of that before you signed the contract, Mr. Harvey. Or perhaps you simply assumed your unconventional charm would be enough to bamboozle everyone." The insult, delivered with such calculated precision, hung in the air. Even Judge Thompson seemed taken aback by the sheer venom of it. The pen tapping stopped. He fixed Steve with a stern gaze. The amusement had vanished entirely, replaced by a growing sense of skepticism. He leaned back in his chair, a subtle shift in posture that suggested he was no longer entirely certain which side of the case he was on. The courtroom held its breath, waiting for Steve's response. Anecdotes and ambiguity. Steve shuffled his notes, a disheveled stack of yellow legal pads held together by a single, trembling paperclip. He cleared his throat, the sound amplified to a thunderous roar by the courtroom's hushed anticipation. Reginald Thornton, resplendent in a bespoke suit that probably cost more than Steve's entire wardrobe, sat beside him, radiating an almost palpable aura of smug victimhood. Chad, across the aisle, leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips, practically daring Steve to begin. "Well now," Steve started, his voice a touch too loud. "Reminds me of a time back in West Virginia, when I was just a young fella." A collective rustle rippled through the gallery. Chad's smirk widened into a full-blown grin. He exchanged a knowing glance with his co-counsel. "My grandpappy, bless his soul, he had this prize-winning hog, Gertrude. Now, Gertrude wasn't just any hog, she was opinionated, let's just say. One day, she got loose, Gertrude did, and she ran right into Mrs. Henderson's petunia patch. Now, Mrs. Henderson, she wasn't too happy about that, not one bit." Chad chuckled audibly. A few titters echoed from the back of the courtroom. Even some of Thornton's own entourage looked perplexed. Thornton himself shifted uncomfortably, the smugness momentarily faltering. Steve, oblivious or perhaps deliberately ignoring the reaction, continued. "Mrs. Henderson, she threatened to sue Grandpappy for the cost of them petunias. Grandpappy, he just scratched his head and said, 'Ma'am, them petunias weren't worth the trouble.' But Mrs. Henderson, she was a stubborn woman." He paused, scratching his own head, mirroring his grandfather's gesture. "Now, what does this have to do with Mr. Thornton here, you ask? Well, it's about value, see? About what's truly important." He beamed, a genuine, almost childlike smile spreading across his face. Chad stood up, halfway, as if to object, then sat back down, shaking his head in disbelief. "Objection, Your Honor, to the introduction of porcine-related anecdotes that have absolutely no bearing on the case at hand." He finally sputtered, the courtroom erupting in suppressed laughter. Judge Thompson, who had been maintaining a carefully neutral expression, sighed. "Mr. Harvey, I understand you're attempting to establish a framework But I would appreciate it if you could steer your opening statement towards the pertinent facts of the case. Yes, ma'am, Your Honor. Just setting the scene, is all. Steve winked at the jury, a gesture that seemed to further solidify Chad's conviction that he was dealing with an utter buffoon. He segued, somewhat clumsily, into a story about a leaky faucet, then a meandering tale about a lost dog. Each anecdote seemed more irrelevant than the last, each detour further cementing the impression of incompetence. Chad watched, a growing sense of bewildered amusement warring with his professional outrage. He couldn't decide if Steve was simply inept, or if he was employing some bizarre, incomprehensible strategy. Thornton, however, was no longer amused. He leaned in, his voice a low hiss. Harvey, what in God's name are you doing? This is a mockery. Steve patted his client's hand reassuringly. Trust me, Mr. Thornton. Just trust me. We ain't even got to the good part yet. His eyes twinkled, a hint of something sharp and calculating flickering beneath the folksy facade. The mogul's mask. Reginald Thornton occupied the witness stand as if it were a throne newly claimed. He smoothed the fabric of his bespoke navy suit, its subtle pinstripes a silent testament to wealth, and favored the jury with a patronizing smile. His testimony commenced predictably, a well-rehearsed soliloquy on virtuous intentions. He evoked the Thornton Foundation's annual gala, a bright spot for disadvantaged youth. His cadence imbued with practiced conviction. He painted a picture of a glittering ballroom, the delicate chink of crystal flutes, the hushed awe as he proclaimed the evening's fundraising success, a sum now sadly diminished, he lamented, due to Steve's client's alleged malfeasance. This was more than just a financial blow, Thornton asserted, his gaze sweeping across the panel. It concerned principles of trust and the promises we made to those children. Promises broken, leaving them profoundly let down. He paused, letting the sentiment resonate within the room. Steve observed him, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. Thornton was skilled, perhaps overly so. The carefully crafted persona of the wrong benefactor bordered on impregnable, yet Steve detected a fault line beneath the facade, a discord between the polished rhetoric and the man himself. Mr. Thornton, Steve began, his tone even, almost courteous. This gala you've depicted, it sounds rather extravagant. Thornton's posture tightened, his smile wavering. Such lavishness is essential to attract the caliber of donors required. One must cultivate an atmosphere of affluence, of prosperity. Naturally, Steve concurred smoothly. And what proportion of the funds generated at this gala actually made its way to the children's programs? Thornton hesitated, a spark of irritation flashing across his features. The lion's share. A significant portion. Of course, there are administrative overheads, marketing initiatives, staffing costs. Marketing, Steve echoed, tilting his head. Such as the double-page spread in Connoisseur magazine showcasing you, Mr. Thornton, positioned alongside a magnificent yacht, under the banner Thornton Foundation, charting a course for a brighter future? A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Thornton's face deepened to a blotchy crimson. That was promotional material. To raise awareness, naturally. Awareness of the children, or of Reginald Thornton's philanthropy? Steve inquired, his voice still restrained, yet laced with a subtle sharpness previously absent. Thornton sputtered. I object, Your Honor. This is immaterial. Sustained, ruled the judge, but the blemish was already apparent. The spotless image Thornton had painstakingly assembled now bore a distinct fracture. Steve pressed on, his line of questioning evolving. Let's discuss the gala's entertainment, Mr. Thornton. My understanding is you engaged a somewhat unusual act? Thornton's unease intensified. It was a conjurer. A highly acclaimed illusionist. An illusionist, Steve repeated, drawing out the word with deliberation. And what was the concept behind his performance? Thornton shuffled in his seat. It was business-themed. He caused briefcases to vanish, produced stock certificates from nowhere. It was diverting. Diverting, Steve stated, a glint of steel now audible in his delivery. Or perhaps a reflection of your own predilections, Mr. Thornton? Perhaps a demonstration of your personal talent for magically creating and dissolving capital? Thornton's grip on the chair arms tightened until his knuckles shone bone white. The courtroom atmosphere grew dense, thick with unspoken allegations. The mask of the altruistic magnate was crumbling, exposing something darker, something infinitely more intricate. The jury, now utterly captivated, leaned forward, their gazes riveted by the unfolding drama. Steve, underestimated and dismissed for too long, had landed the first telling blow. Cracks in the facade. Mr. Thornton, Steve began, his voice deceptively mild. You testified earlier that you considered young Timothy here more like a son than a mere scholarship recipient. Is that accurate? Thornton, perched stiffly on the stand, puffed out his chest. Absolutely. I took a personal interest in the boy's welfare. Provided guidance, mentorship, opportunities. Opportunities like, say, a summer internship at Thornton Industries? Precisely. Thornton beamed, seemingly pleased to revisit his generosity. An internship that, according to company records, paid him significantly below minimum wage, and involved him primarily in cleaning out storage rooms? Chad leaped to his feet. Objection! Counsel is badgering the witness and misrepresenting evidence. Sustained, the judge said, her gaze sharp on Steve. Mr. Harvey, confine yourself to relevant lines of questioning. Steve simply nodded. Mr. Thornton, were you aware of the wage discrepancies? Thornton shifted in his seat. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. I delegate those matters to my HR department. Of course. And you also delegated the responsibility of ensuring young Timothy's safety during his internship? Steve's voice hardened slightly. Naturally. Safety is paramount at Thornton Industries. Yet, the company's safety log shows several near-miss incidents involving Timothy, including one where he nearly fell from a faulty ladder while cleaning a storage room on the 3rd floor. Were you aware of these incidents? Chad was on his feet again. Objection! Speculation! Counsel is attempting to paint my client as negligent without providing concrete proof of negligence. Overruled, the judge declared. The witness will answer the question. Thornton's face was now visibly flushed. He dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief. I wasn't personally aware of every minor incident. We have protocols in place. Protocols that apparently failed to prevent Timothy from sustaining a serious injury while on your property. An injury that has effectively ended his athletic career. Steve paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Mr. Thornton, you also stated that you provided Timothy with unwavering support. Yet, after the accident, you terminated his scholarship, effectively cutting off his financial lifeline. Is that consistent with your definition of support? Chad's voice was rising. Objection! Harassment! Counsel is deliberately twisting the facts and attempting to prejudice the jury. Mr. Chambers, the judge warned, her voice laced with steel. Control yourself. I understand your zealous advocacy for your client, but these outbursts are becoming disruptive. She turned to Steve. Mr. Harvey, you are treading dangerously close to irrelevant tangents. I remind you that the core issue here is the alleged breach of contract, not Mr. Thornton's moral character. Stay focused. Steve bowed his head slightly. Understood, Your Honor. He turned back to Thornton, a faint smile playing on his lips. Just one more question, Mr. Thornton. You claim that Timothy's unauthorized participation in the regional qualifier jeopardized his amateur status and therefore invalidated the scholarship. Is that correct? Precisely. Thornton seized on the opportunity to regain his footing. He violated the terms of the agreement. It was a clear breach. But isn't it also true, Mr. Thornton, that Thornton Industries holds a substantial sponsorship agreement with the very organization that runs those regional qualifiers? An agreement that benefits your company immensely through positive publicity and branding? The color drained from Thornton's face. Chad remained seated, seemingly stunned. In other words, Steve concluded, his voice now a low, dangerous rumble, Timothy's athletic success, even in a breach of contract, ultimately benefited you, Mr. Thornton. Didn't it? The whistleblower. The courtroom air thickened, heavy with anticipation. Thornton, perched on the witness stand like a smug king on his throne, was in full flow. He painted a portrait of himself as a selfless philanthropist, a victim of Harvey's malicious vendetta. His voice dripped with injured innocence, each word carefully chosen to sway the jury. Steve, however, remained unnervingly calm. He stood and addressed the judge. Your Honor, at this time, the defense would like to call Dolores Jenkins to the stand. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Chad, Thornton's slick lawyer, visibly stiffened. Thornton himself blanched, the color draining from his face like water from a punctured bucket. Dolores Jenkins shuffled forward, a small, unassuming figure swallowed by the vastness of the courtroom. Her eyes darted nervously around, but she met Steve's gaze with a flicker of gratitude. She was sworn in, her voice a bare whisper against the expectant silence. Steve approached her gently. Ms. Jenkins, can you please state your full name and former employment? Dolores Jenkins. I was Mr. Thornton's executive assistant for almost 8 years. Her voice gained a fraction of confidence. And during those 8 years, Ms. Jenkins, were you privy to the inner workings of Thornton Enterprises, and more specifically, the charitable events Mr. Thornton organized? Dolores hesitated, her gaze flicking towards Thornton. His eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, were now filled with a raw, desperate plea. But she looked back at Steve, and in his calm, reassuring expression, she found her resolve. Yes, she said, the word ringing with unexpected strength. I was. And then she spoke. She spoke of inflated valuations of donated artwork, of shell corporations used to funnel profits, of charitable galas where the vast majority of the funds ended up lining Thornton's already overflowing pockets. She detailed specific instances, dates, amounts, each delivered with unwavering accuracy. She even produced copies of internal memos, her voice trembling as she authenticated Thornton's own signature. The courtroom hung on every word. The jury, previously a sea of impassive faces, were now leaning forward, their eyes glued to Dolores. Thornton shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence dissolving like mist in the morning sun. Chad finally found his voice, interrupting Dolores's testimony with a sharp objection. Hearsay. Speculation. Overruled. The judge declared, his voice firm. Ms. Jenkins is providing direct evidence based on her personal experience and documents in her possession. Chad, sensing the tide turning, switched tactics. He launched into a scathing cross-examination, attempting to discredit Dolores, painting her as a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge. Isn't it true, Ms. Jenkins, that you were terminated for poor performance? That you hold a personal grudge against Mr. Thornton? Dolores's chin lifted slightly. I was let go after I questioned some of the accounting practices, she stated calmly. And no, I don't hold a grudge. I just believe that people should be held accountable for their actions. Steve watched, a quiet satisfaction blooming within him. Dolores Jenkins wasn't just a witness, she was a force of nature, fueled by a quiet but unshakable sense of justice. The courtroom, once Thornton's stage, was now hers. Turning the tables. Mr. Thornton, Steve said, his voice cutting through the tense courtroom air. You've painted a very convincing picture of yourself as a wronged man. A generous benefactor, betrayed by a rogue employee. Thornton, perched precariously on the witness stand, puffed out his chest. That is precisely what I am. Generous, you say? Steve strolled towards the jury, a tablet in his hand. Would you call betting against your own tennis tournament generous, Mr. Thornton? A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Chad, sitting behind Thornton, went ashen. Thornton's face tightened. That's absurd. I would never. Steve stopped in front of the jury box, turning the tablet towards them. A series of betting slips flashed on the screen, each one a losing wager against the tournament. Each one traced back to an offshore account, meticulously documented. These are betting slips, Mr. Thornton. Large ones. placed just days before the tournament began. All against the Thornton Invitational. All originating from an account in the Cayman Islands. An account, I might add, linked directly to Thornton Enterprises. Thornton sputtered. Fabrications. Forgeries. Harvey, you're grasping at straws. Steve turned to Judge Thompson. Your Honor, I move to admit these documents as evidence. I also called Dolores Jenkins to the stand. Dolores, a woman who had previously faded into the background, walked nervously to the witness stand. Her eyes darted around the room, landing briefly on Steve, who offered a small, encouraging nod. Ms. Jenkins, Steve began, his voice gentle. You were formerly Mr. Thornton's executive assistant, correct? Yes, sir, she said, her voice barely a whisper. And during your time in that role, were you ever asked to perform financial transactions on Mr. Thornton's behalf? Dolores hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Many times. Specifically, were you ever asked to transfer funds to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands? Thornton shot out of his chair. Objection! This is hearsay. Judge Thompson slammed his gavel. Mr. Thornton, sit down. Ms. Jenkins, you may answer the question. Dolores swallowed hard. Yes. I wired funds to that account on several occasions. I didn't know what they were for at the time. I was just following instructions. Steve approached the witness stand, his voice soft. Did you ever hear Mr. Thornton discuss betting on the tournament, Ms. Jenkins? Dolores's eyes met Thornton's. For a moment, the courtroom held its breath. Yes, she said, her voice gaining strength. I overheard him talking on the phone. He was saying something about hedging his bets and making a killing either way. The blood drained from Thornton's face. Chad covered his face with his hands. Steve turned back to the jury, his voice ringing with conviction. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence is clear. Reginald Thornton wasn't just a victim. He was the architect of this entire scheme. He used this tournament, and the players who competed in it, for his own personal gain. Judge Thompson fixed Thornton with a steely gaze. Mr. Thornton, he said, his voice laced with disapproval. This court is deeply disturbed by the evidence presented. You have abused your position and betrayed the trust placed in you. I strongly suggest you reconsider your defense. Justice is served. Members of the jury, Steve began, his voice a clear bell in the hushed courtroom. Abandoning the podium, he approached the 12 arbiters of Chad's fate. After days of testimony and a mountain of documents, I know this case can seem complex. But peel away the layers, and you'll find a core question: where does the truth reside? He paused, allowing the gravity of his inquiry to settle. Mr. Thornton presents himself as wronged, a generous soul betrayed by ingratitude. He cultivates an image of civic virtue, a man beyond reproach. But I implore you, scrutinize that facade. Observe the contradictions in his account, the artful dodges in his replies, the carefully constructed persona that cracks under scrutiny. Steve's gaze swung to Reginald Thornton, stiff and composed at the defense table, his face a mask of disdain. Then came Dolores Jenkins. A woman who risked much to testify, to share her knowledge. A woman whose initial trepidation was palpable, yet whose resolve strengthened as she spoke her truth. Turning back, Steve addressed the jury directly. Dolores gains nothing from this. No monetary reward, no fleeting fame. Her sole desire is justice, to unburden her conscience. Can the same be said for Mr. Thornton? Retreating to the podium, Steve gathered his thoughts, scarcely needing the notes before him. This extends beyond a simple contract dispute. It concerns probity, accountability for those in positions of power. It sends a clear signal: honesty still holds value, truth still triumphs, even against wealth and influence. He met each juror's gaze in turn, seeking connection. I urge you to weigh the evidence diligently, assess the testimonies impartially, and render a verdict that embodies the principles of fairness and justice upon which this nation was built. Thank you. The jury retired, their expressions inscrutable. A nervous hum filled the courtroom. Beside Steve, Chad sat pale and damp, his former arrogance evaporated. Thornton, remarkably, remained controlled, though a telltale tick flickered beneath his left eye. Hours stretched, each marked by the thrum of fluorescent lights that amplified the tense silence. Finally, the bailiff's voice cut through the air. "All rise. The jury has reached a verdict." They filed back, their faces still shields. The foreman rose, clutching the paper. "In the matter of Harvey versus Thornton, we, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff." A collective intake of breath swept the room. Chad visibly deflated with relief. Thornton's composure shattered, his jaw tightened, and fury blazed in his eyes. The judge released the jury. As they departed, Steve felt a touch on his arm. Dolores Jenkins, tears tracing paths down her cheeks, whispered, "Thank you for believing me." Steve offered a reassuring smile. "The truth prevails always." Stepping outside, Steve was greeted by a wall of sound. The verdict had ignited a firestorm. A crowd chanted his name. Signs reading, "Justice for the little guy," and "Harvey for the people," bobbed in the air. He found himself hoisted aloft, carried through a sea of cheering faces. Camera flashes pulsed like lightning. He had triumphed. More than just winning a case, he had become an emblem. A beacon of hope for those feeling crushed by the weight of wealth and corruption. Thornton's reputation lay in ruins. Chad's career, once intertwined with Thornton's, was now deeply compromised. And Steve, the unlikely champion, had shown that even when facing seemingly insurmountable odds, justice could still prevail.